Mr. Woo.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Let me just get my timer up. I'll take a POI at around 5 minutes. Please put them in the chat. Okay. Starting in thousands of academics, individual independent research.
We stop hearing you, okay?
To access. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Can you try again, because there didn't go well in terms of sound.
Oh, okay. Is there something attached?
It is better now. Maybe it's just like the angle that you speak towards the computer.
Okay. I'll bring it closer. That's
Yeah,
okay.
thank you.
Restart.
Okay, yeah, I'll restart. Okay. Is that clearer?
Yes, it's good now.
Okay, great. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The case from OG is very simple. Thousands of independent researchers, individual academics, and growing institutions struggle to access the information that they need in order to do good research, in order to educate individuals and create new innovations. We're going to argue why specifically research journals are the ones that are the biggest barrier to entry, and how this motion is going to remove that barrier and allow us to get that innovation that we so require. So what's the model look like? What does piracy look like? Piracy involves reading academic papers that typically cost thousands of pounds to access behind paywalls in academic journals. Supporting this in the motion means that it's acceptable and encouraged for individuals to pirate these academic papers published by these journals and lock behind these paywalls. This looks like things like accessing these papers on Sci-Hub or like Library Genesis. And this also means that we're going to ramp down the prosecution of individuals who engage in academic piracy. This means looking at leniency in cases where individual academics get caught pirating information from these, or individuals get caught doing piracy from these things. I think that this doesn't mean that we're going to accept all forms of piracy. We're just accepting and ramping down prosecution specifically for academic piracy. What also is important to model is that institutions are likely to still pay for these papers. That is, rich institutions that have a very high prestige or reputation. These institutions are likely to still pay for these papers, just because piracy in general is against the law, but de facto we are not going to enforce that law. That's what the model is going to look like. Okay, so how does it work under status quo? Typically, what happens is researchers do research and write papers using funding typically from external sources, from private companies, from governments, and from the university. They then write up their research and submit this research to journals where they undergo peer review. Typically, peer review is done a voluntary process, but I'll give structural reasons why it's voluntary as well. And then this gets copied and written up and published by the journal. Okay, so firstly, why are journals able to charge such prohibitively high prices and therefore make it extremely hard to access these papers and research in the first place? 3 key reasons. Firstly, the market is very monopolistic, because there's very few, because research is so hyper specialized, there are very few journals in every single research field. That is, if I publish in, for example, cardiovascular science, there's probably 2 or 3 journals within that thing that I can actually publish it in. But also, along with this monopolistic behavior, it is very prestige focused. That is, there are just a small group of extremely highly prestigious journals that every researcher wants to publish in. Notice that your ability to get professorships and tenure and advance in your career is dependent on getting your papers published in these most prestigious journals, which means that these journals can charge whatever money they like, because they know that people will always come to them and try and publish with them, right? Because their entire researchers' career trajectories are decided based on the journal they publish in, and also because there's so few of them. But secondly, right, they also, and what happens as well is these journals put restrictions on individual researchers from sharing this research in order to protect their profits and protect their bottom line, which means that I, as a researcher, cannot just give and share my research once I've published it in the journal, because the journal wants to ensure it keeps its profit. But and you don't want the journal to retract your paper or remove your paper from there. Secondly, right, the good is unique to them. That is, only this journal possesses this information, which means they can charge any money you need, because if I need to know and understand something, there is only one place and one paper that's been published on the cutting edge of this very niche thing that I'm researching and I need to access from this researcher. And so I'm only able to access this information from this journal, which means this journal can can charge whatever they like in order to let me get access. But thirdly, right, journals cater towards institutions which are their main market. Notice a lot of existing institutions in the Western world are very rich, and so will be willing to pay the money regardless. This is like universities like Oxford and Cambridge and London, which have huge research grants and huge amounts of funding, which means that they're able to pay any price that the journal charges for them. I think fourthly, it's just an empirical fact. If you Google it, you can see that if you Google and try and access a paper, the individual charges like £2,000 for a paper. I think that's something acceptable. So what happens on our side? On our side, we help underprivileged academics the most, and we help poor growing institutions. We help small research startups, particularly in the developing world, get access to research that they otherwise cannot get because of prohibitively high prices from these journals. How does this look? Firstly, I think that since journals cater towards journals do not cater to individuals or poorer institutions or smaller companies who are not able to afford this because they're able to get super profits for all the reasons I've given you. What this means is those individuals have less access to the information that they need. This looks like things like learning the prior methods of research or learning the most cutting edge techniques in their research to apply to their own research to make it better, but also to prevent the duplication of research. Oftentimes you need to be able to know what is in these papers being published by these journals. So if you don't have this, you're much more likely to duplicate your research. But secondly, you just find gaps in the literature by reading a lot of different papers. You're able to understand more about the literature, find gaps, and get inspired to do your own research. This looks like things like creating cutting economic methods, right? So if you're trying to develop and better understand your own country's economy and create an informed economic policy in your own country, you want to probably look at research papers published elsewhere on the economy. This is amplified exponentially to all other research fields. Thirdly, it just improves innovation, particularly in companies and startups, right? Who often need these better scientific methods in order to maintain a competitive edge. They need to have access to things like industrial standards. They need to have access to things like cutting edge technologies and be able to put them in place. But fourthly, education just gets much more modernized. Students at universities have access to better research. So even if institutions can afford it for their academics, they can't afford the subscription for everyone. So this means students get better research. Before I continue closing.
Yeah, so for the average academic, even if we grant that these subscriptions are super costly, they have to run labs, hire PhDs. That's way more expensive. So this is a very small portion of their costs.
No, it is a major portion because I've explained why this monopolistic and all the reasons I gave at the beginning is why it's so expensive. But even if you don't buy that, even if you think, oh, this is such a small cost, notice these institutions and individuals pay this amount of money to access these papers. This is lost money that is traded off against other things. That means that according to you, they could spend that money on things like PhD students. They could spend that money on experiments. Now they lose that money because they're spending it and giving that to journals unnecessarily, right? So there's a lost opportunity cost there, which is that researchers can pay that. Also, individuals and people who are doing research on their own, especially in countries where there are no institutions present, those individuals have to do research on their own. We make it far less prohibitively expensive for those individuals to do their own research. This looks like things like grassroots level research in specific marginalized communities. It's really important that we have those because we often don't have institutions operating in the area or academics operating in the area to allow this research to happen in the first place. This is often the only way that you're able to get it. We allow those individuals to apply the most modern methods and the most modern methodology and techniques and be able to access that research. For all those reasons, extremely proud to propose.
Okay, we thank the speaker for that speech, and to continue, very proud to call upon leader of opposition. Ooh.
Hi. One second. Starting in 3. Oh, 1 second. Yep. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The biggest impact in this debate is where do you create better organic incentives to research and where do we get better research as a conclusion. We'll prove to you this through two distinct ways. First, we tell you that we break the very monopoly that PM frames for us the reason for this monopolistic tendency or frame to exist in current reality is because academic piracy is rampant. We'll tell you why academic piracy being rampant means that you shove away space that could be given to alternative journals to platform themselves, and why that's incredibly bad. That's the first piece of analysis that we'll have on why the supply side issue gets fixed. On the second side, we'll tell you why the pressure on our side will be more on these big journals to give better contracts or to have better negotiating ability with these small researchers. All that PM frame, such as, oh, me being forced to pay $1,000 for even trying to get myself, I don't know, checked or proved, and all those kinds of ridiculous things that journals like Nature does. That's the demand side of it. On the supply side of it, there are 5 things to prove. Firstly, why does piracy rid, or why is piracy money? Like, why does research need money, or why do these journals need money? There are no advertisements or things like this on like there, right? But second, because there is no audience to attract, it's a heavily academic audience, so it's even difficult to figure out what kind of advertisers would want to platform themselves there. But secondly, we think if they take too much corpo funding from any particular side of the aisle, they're bound to be called out by the elite academic left and all those kinds of threats that they have. So they solely rely on the revenue stream that small researchers pay to them, and the people wanting to access that paywall pay to them. What is this money used for, and how do journals exhaust this very quickly? Money goes towards a lot of administrative stuff. You need to edit thousands and thousands of research entries that you have gotten. You need to pay developers to keep the site up to date and things like that. But secondly, you need to give some kind of money to contributors who are successful, right? Because that's the royalty program that happens, that you get a percentage cut of every specific click that your paper gets, and every specific like view once program that your paper gets, and things like that. That's why they need a lot of money to sustain themselves. The second thing to say is, why do people not pay in the status quo? This is due to 2 reasons. First, no one funds or buys subscription of a random like journal which goes ahead and does vascular science, is because there is no prestige associated to it. Because right now, the only thing forcing you to take the subscription of a journal is the prestige associated with that. Viewers think that there is no specific return on investment that I can guarantee myself. I'm not sure if every article or every paper that comes up is worth it or not. Not sure if the payment is worth, like the per dollar investment is something that I'm trying to go ahead and rationalize in the best possible way. The second reason is that it's zero sum. Right now, because of the astronomical prices, it's incredibly difficult to go ahead and do anything at all. You can't take subscription from multiple avenues because it just becomes difficult to sustain all of them at once. What changes is how this monopoly now shifts on our side of the house. We think the monopoly changes in 2 specific regards. First, when everyone is forced to pay, we think that people will obviously look for cheaper or better alternatives. That is to say, the competition resolves itself. If Nature is being an asshole and charging exorbitant prices for their behavior, we think the pressure of competing journals will just get to them, and people will be more likely to try those new avenues out because of favorable deals that they're getting from them. This competition does not kick in right now because there is no need for people to collectivize and pressurize people into going ahead and lobbying against a massive institution like Nature itself. The first thing then is the competition that you create. But second thing then is the direct implication of this behavior on research quality itself. We think right now these journals are just able to get away with zero accountability with respect to how exactly transparent the process is. If I apply, there is no explanation of why I got rejected. Is this that I got rejected or something like that? When there is competition, we think that's better and fairer for small researchers, because at the very best, they get alternate avenues to platform themselves. But at the very worst, they at least get some explanation of how this hiring process exists. And all of that is extremely formalized. That's the supply side of things. But second, on the demand side of things, right? We think that it's extremely important right now in the status quo to have accountability because of the way that these small researchers are treated. Massive fees to enroll and all of that. We think 2 key things happen now as a consequence of that. Firstly, we think we are able to negotiate better deals in this itself, because note, the prestige means that it gets the most amount of media eyeballs and the most amount of academic eyeballs scrutinizing it at any given point of time. So that means you're able to negotiate better deals because you want to platform those better prices. But also from the side of viewers, right? When viewers are forced to go ahead and just pay their way through research and things like that, we think the kind of just pressure on these institutions is massive because of the mechanisms that OG gave about the need for for this research and the need to democratize it so much. We think we can only ensure better behavior when this kind of like competition or collectivization exists. But secondly, we think the pressure can also exist to go ahead and fund this kind of small research and subscription. Why is this the most important thing in the debate, and what are the two impacts of this? Before that, CG.
Yeah, if these journals are so expensive and difficult to run, as you explain, why won't they consolidate in your counterfactual?
Because what happens in the counterfactual is that people are not complicit in the monopolization taking place. People actually do care about research for the reasons that everyone agrees about. And people then go ahead and tend to support the competing journals which are coming up. Right now, the incentive doesn't exist because you can just siphon off that research from Sci-Hub or other websites like that. We think that's the reason that this doesn't happen right now. Two things that happen as a consequence of this. We think small research, like researchers, small colleges with research, they all get more avenues to platform themselves on because the competition now is not saturated at the middle. We think there are incentives for the market to expand to the niches. That's good for them to platform themselves and an incentive to go ahead and keep this research up because of the monetary benefits that they will be receiving because of the royalty schemes and domestic sales program and things like that. But secondly, we think this big journal monopoly being broken is the most important thing in the debate for two key reasons. Firstly, we think that this creates an additional layer of check and balance because now there is competition even at the level of how do you vet certain applications and how do you discard certain applications. When this formalization gets better, this means the most needy and the most deserving candidates are the ones who get published on these sites often, and that takes away from having to rely on voluntary actors coming in and filling in that gap. That's massive because we rely on their goodwill in the status quo. But secondly, because in the comparative, these small researchers have nowhere to go to. Once they invest this money for enrolling themselves, at the very worst, they lose a lot of money because they're not allowed. At the very best, they're not able to get through because of the massive monopoly that exists.
Okay, thank the speaker for that speech. And to continue, very proud to call Deputy Prime Minister. Still muted.
Okay. Can you guys hear me now? See me now? Great. So, two questions in this debate. First, on the economic viability of journals in a world where piracy is supported. And secondly, on why we get more research, better research, and faster research, and why that's the most important impact in this debate. Let's start on that first question then about the economic viability of journals, because OO's path to victory in this debate is to explain why piracy reduces the economic vitality of these journals and as a result leads to worse research being produced. I have a number of responses. The first thing that I want to explain is that they miss Ahmed's key framing here, which explains why there will still be buy-in into these big journals. And the reason why that is true is because institutions who are the largest subscribers to journals, so things like businesses, things like consulting firms, things like major universities, will continue to subscribe to these journals officially on their side of the house, whether or not we support piracy for two reasons. The first reason why is because these institutions are law-abiding institutions with a lot of public buy-in and a lot of public trust. Oxford, for instance, is not going to pirate pirate all of the research that it gives to its students, in the same way that Deloitte is not going to pirate all of the research that they use in their consulting. But secondly, because it is an incredibly bad image for them to pirate all of their research, it becomes incredibly unclear why they are using informal avenues in order to access this research when they have the resources to do it anyway. And this is really important because these actors cannot break the law. On both sides of the house, they're going to continue to fund these journals, which means that the largest source of journal funding is going to remain symmetric on both sides of the house. They have to deal with our framing here. But secondly, we would ask the question to this team, why are journals still alive if things like Sci-Hub exist? Why are journals still so prestigious if things like these piracy organizations exist? Because there are symmetric incentives on both sides for these journals to be funded by various actors and to be kept alive. And that is because everyone in society generally recognizes the value of research, the importance of scientific discovery and good methodological review and ensuring good public policy. Governments fund these grants with public money. Oftentimes universities pay for these grants as well. So there are a ton of private actors who symmetrically on both sides continue to fund this research. But more importantly, we explain that on the counterfactual, these journals operate in ways which have incredibly monopolistic characteristics, as we explain at Ahmed, which is important because what they say is because of competition, as a result, these journals are going to compete and lower the price of research, lowering the barrier to entry. I have 3 responses to this. Firstly, they misunderstand the information economy. That is to say, the particular premium that is put on good information in academia particularly. So the reason why it is the case that journals function as monopolies is because of the historical legacy surrounding intellectualism, right? So like there's a huge premium on academic prestige. There's a huge premium on the trajectory of the past papers that this journal has published. The validity of your paper is oftentimes a symptom of the paper that you have submitted and published that journal in. And that is incredibly important because as a result of this academic prestige, they have a tight grip on the marketplace of ideas. That is to say, which ones actually go into informing policy, which ones actually have a sway in society, which ones are actually taken seriously, which means that they have the continued ability to raise the prices of their journals, but people will continue to buy them because this information is seen as key. But secondly, we explain that not many companies actually compete in this market because very few actually exist within the marketplace. So sure, perhaps there are some smaller scientific journals that might do the cheaper forms of research that they want, but it's incredibly unclear to me that that is going to be the kind of research that receives a lot of public buy-in. In fact, if you think about it, like competing over information, over truth and science, and by lowering prices seems like something that's probably going to suss a lot of people out. But more than this, over the past 10 years, we have seen a trend where the number of journals have actually consolidated. There have become fewer of them over the course of time because of the very fact that there are many high fixed costs to doing this, because of the fact that you need many editors, because of the fact that there's basically you have total control over information, which means that you are able to raise prices as much as you want. And what this means is that the competition mechanism that they propose as making research freer on their side is not going to make research freer. At the end of all of this rebuttal, it's clear that on both sides of the house, journals are going to continue to exist to a pretty large margin because of the clear function that they have in society. The difference in this debate is about whether or not people are able to access that research. Before I move then into weighing that issue, I'll talk to CO.
Yeah, so in an industry that's doing well, companies don't want to merge because they think they could do fine on their own. Only when the industry starts to fail is that when they are forced to merge together, and that makes
no, that is just paradigmatically false. The reason why industries monopolize is because they generate supernormal profits. Like you can go from good to even better. That logic does not make sense. So let's talk then about why our case is so important. We explain that the rise of piracy democratizes access to information, spawns better global research capable of informing key societal changes, particularly in places that are at a disadvantage in terms of academic infrastructure. Why? Ahmed explains that publishing houses in the status quo have monopolistic characteristics for the reasons that I just gave you. And this is incredibly important because the piracy of research now enables that information to be more public, more available, creating a number of impacts. The first is that more research niches are identified and research talent around the world is better allocated to research gaps, because a key part of research is identifying what is the gap in the literature, what extra study could be done on this particular topic. And now researchers across the world are able to see that and apply that in their own research, applying their talent to those critical research holes that are now able to be filled because we just better matched like the supply to the demand of researchers. Secondly, there was a diffusion of methodological techniques, ensuring that the best techniques around the world are able to be used. You are able to access a wide scope of methods because now all research is in your hands. Note, oftentimes the most novel and effective techniques are the most paywalled in prestigious journals because those are the techniques that receive publication in the most prestigious journals. And people in developing countries or less resourced academic institutions simply have less ability to adopt those techniques in the absence of this. However, now what we are able to do on Arts of the House is diffuse those methodological techniques and people can learn from them. There are two impacts of this. The first is that you prevent poor research, because even small methodological differences in research shape research outcomes massively. Using a difference in differences approach versus a qualitative method, for instance, would create a huge difference in testing whether or not a first past the post or parliamentary system is a better political system in Java. Using one method over another is far more effective in determining whether healthcare decentralization works. These research methodological changes create far more impactful and good policies, and we enable that by giving them the resources to run our side of the house. But secondly, we create faster research because information is just far more quickly available to lots of people, meaning that these researchers and small groups of people, these startups, these people around the world are better able to enact research far quicker. Why is this the most important impact in the debate? Because even if there are alternative sources of getting this methodological information, even if they throw a bunch of mitigation at this case, research and the quantity of research and the amount of information in the world is the prerequisite to any form of positive change. To the extent that we are able to produce more positive research that trickles into the realms of the economy, of the government, of all kinds of things in society, a prerequisite to that is people being able to access research and enact it within their own countries. And we think it is good that we democratize information. Thanks, and OG.
Okay, we thank the speaker for that speech, and to continue, very proud to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Why can universities that are smaller not earn money on side government? The first thing I want to point out is that they explicitly tell you how piracy is likely to be knocked down on by large institutions when they mention things like prosecution. Institutions like Oxford and Cambridge can sue you if you use their article without actually paying for it, because they have the resources to afford lawyers and the amount of information required to then catch you and blacklist you in a large way. But smaller universities don't have these resources because the cost of this is so high that to catch every single person pirating their research would then outweigh the possible benefit of a certain piece of revenue, which means that large journals continue earning revenue while small journals get hit hardest with piracy. And as a result, small universities lose the most money from piracy. Second of all, note that in terms of revenue, the government logic is that institutions pay for journals, but also you don't get access to research at all on their side. Let's clear this up on what they're actually saying, right? Institutions do pay specifically for things like Nature, like the Oxford University Press, because those are the ones that explicitly enforce this and force them to pay those things to get access to articles to be relevant in the world. We agree to this. But they don't pay for different smaller journals because they can cite those articles and get the information from them for free online because it's rampant in the way PM describes it, which means that you can use Sci-Hub to gain access to research from your state university or from like Florida State or Penn State or something, but you cannot do that for Oxford or Princeton, which means that you keep gaining access to this research. You have no incentive to pay those journals. And as a result, the journals don't make money. Why is there a demand for this research in the first place? Why do we gain money in the first place? The first thing is proximity. You know, research tends to be relevant in the basis of who it affects. So if you're doing research in a certain area or a certain country, especially if you're a poor nation, often governments and other institutions that are, say, using like corporations who are trying to find market information, need this information specifically from your area. So they need that research in their coffers to understand how the R&D department should function. They can pirate it right now. If they don't pirate it, they have to buy it, one source of revenue. Second of all, things come up all the time. There's new problems that are immensely changing the world. And I don't think every elite institution solves all of them. Perhaps they do the most interesting, useful academic research, but there's often specific lacuna, which is part of these issues that don't get researched. So for example, how a machine learning model affects a specific type of company you're running might be done by a local university or another smaller university. So the niches that OG talks about beat them in their own case because they create demand for different types of research from lots of revenue sources. The third thing is that, you have to understand this research as well, not just elite research from Princeton, to understand where to go in the future. So even if you are a researcher, you need to understand what other small researchers have done as well, because if you don't get that information, you don't find the gaps either, which creates revenue for them. Right now, all of this is free and available online on Sci-Hub. If it's from Princeton University Press or if it's from Oxford University Press, then you might get sued for it. And often it's even available because there's high levels of security. And like OG says, you attack the researchers and ask them, how did this get out of your inbox? Did you send it to someone? What happened? All of this means that, note, I don't need to prove that elite institutions keep piracy out of the door, because that is OG's only mechanism for why there isn't access at all. You don't get high quality research if it's expensive, only if you can stop piracy, at which point we show you that that means that this has to be true. Let's explain the impacts of small institutions being able to earn money and explain why they won't consolidate into a big consortium and what this does. This does two things in terms of changing the debate. The first thing it does is it solves opening government's problem better. And the second thing it does is creates benefits. So let's start with the second one. What happens when you have competition? Well, the first thing is that you solve local problems because researchers earn more money. So on-site government, you're trying to gain prestige by publishing in the best journals where, like OG says, you don't get paid that much, and you need to do it to continue succeeding in your career. So you need the royalties from, say, Oxford University Press. You need legitimacy to get grants and things from the government, which are only given to top researchers. On our side, when you publish research that is actually helpful to the people around you, especially solving local problems, you get a revenue stream. This means you can focus on doing research for things that are frequent and consistent in your community, and you get huge amounts of money to then do that. This is an immense impact because when you have more money going to universities and researchers can, for example, improve the bureaucratic apparatus of a government in their local area, or an Indian researcher can tell you why, for example, a subsidy system isn't working, or why a certain technology that we've developed isn't very efficient. When they have the money and time to put effort into all of these things, this exponentially increases consistent and frequent harms and makes them better, which affects lots of people. Compare this to government's benefit. They get access to research methods and they can use this. Let's compare why this is more important. They claim research methods and things that are very, very important in terms of like top level research will completely change the way you do it. The first thing I want to point out is you cannot buy research methods like difference and difference analysis. I think that's a bit absurd. Most researchers have a baseline understanding of how to do research. But second, I would argue primary research is better than understanding things from the outside world and understanding the theory of it, because that doesn't prepare you for the new endeavor you're about to embark on. What you need more is money to spend time looking at what your local government is doing or what's happening in your communities. Perhaps methods help you in a speculative way, but we help you in a certain way. But third of all, we also are more sustainable in growth, because over time, when institutions gain much more money from the type of research they create, they get connections and funding from people who buy their research, who are likely to hire the researchers and trust them more, as opposed to gaining access to their articles through piracy. At that point, you get sustainable sources of revenue which grow your economy a lot more and grow the university's funding over time. Hence, you're not just dependent on funding that Oxford gets, you're dependent on funding that every university gets. Before that, CG.
Yep. Your case hinges on more people paying for access to papers. If institutions are symmetric, which group of people are stopping piracy and have the capacity to pay to such a degree that entire new journals can be set up?
What the fuck are you saying? There's no piracy on our side. That's the fucking point. That's why they pay for it. But second of all, in terms of demand side, yeah, let me get on to that. So on-site government, in the long term, there's less pressure on large institutional journals because the only way journals can exist right now is prestige, and hence they matter immensely and people want to get into those journals. On our side, when you have other institutions who can no longer afford any research because every institution's journal is charging a lot, any type of work you want to do costs you exponentially higher costs because you cannot pirate anything. At that point, it creates pressure to make these journals face accountability. Two things that happen. First, negotiations are more collective at the point where effectively everyone is depending on like extremely expensive research which they can't afford. This forces prices down, which does not happen right now for the reasons OG gave you, which is that most research people use is accessible to them, and the large journals don't get pressured to drop their prices because it's seen as a prestige complex, not an access complex. But second, this means that they're forced to provide better services. Three things this means is that first, like Sai said to you already, it becomes better checks on the type of research you're doing. But second, it's more things like accessibility that OG wants in the long term. The type of research you can't access on OG because of prosecution falls in price over time as people start to realize they simply cannot afford this cost in the long term, which means we win on their metric, on that opening opposition.
Yeah, we thank the speaker for that speech, and to continue, very proud to call member of government.
Gonna assume that I'm audible and start my speech soon. Just give me 2 seconds, please. Three, 2, 1. The extension from closing government is very simple. you have a moral obligation to support this form of piracy, because the existence of these institutions, the existence of these journals as a form of monopolies, they fundamentally assault the dignity and livelihood of these professors. They undermine the mobility and the vast majority of educational institutions and the capacity to provide support, the capacity to provide education, the capacity to provide specialization and uplift the most vulnerable of our society. I'm going to explain firstly how our extension situates within this round. Two things. Firstly, this is the exclusive and it is a principle that is exclusive to pragmatic considerations, because it is the most proximate and certain thing that you ought weigh. Because there may be speculation about the comparative efficacy of academic outcomes, the speculation of OG, of research academic outcomes and innovation, the principal harm that you are able to claim or you are able to solve on the outside of the house is exclusive, is absolutely certain, is something that you must weigh most highly. The second thing I would point out is that the vast majority of the mechanisms that come out from opening half is deeply mitigatory. It is unclear to me that there is actually a significant rise in the quality of publications or academic journalism, given that OO literally don't prove that there's a subset of groups of people who access piracy on the outside of the house would be willing to pay for the new journals that they try to prop on their side of the house, which is to say that the mechanism of dissemination of the quality of these forms of publicization and things like that ought not be weighed, given that it is literally built on the blood of the people who are excluded. That is not something that you ought to support. Three principles. Firstly, that the acquisition and the proposition of these journals are principally evil and abhorrent, because they structurally benefit from historical norms of colonialism, of elitism, of classism. Because OO claims that piracy somehow causes monopolies and the existence of these journals to require monopolies. This is ahistorical. When you look at prestige, it functions as a first mover advantage. When you look at the Nobel Prizes, when you look at the establishment of Harvard and how they excluded individuals from being able to access their education in order to make it extremely prestigious. The literal reason that Elsevier is a big five publisher is because that they existed in 1880s, because they literally functioned in Europe off the colonial interest and off the exclusion of those things. There's a reason why 50% of all academic traffic goes through these big five things. Three reasons for why it is principally abhorrent. Firstly, they abuse Western structures of law. That is to say, they use overwhelming forms of capital to exclude individuals, they use lawsuits and things like that. Secondly, they abuse the existence and the invention of IP laws. That is the inception of the Enlightenment age and the use of the Bretton Woods institutions to assert IP laws on secondary institutions and countries as a justification for plunder and raid, as a justification for the exclusion of access to these forms of education and to the access of these academia. Three, the literally structurally necessitate the cyclical disenfranchisement and exclusion of six key actors and reasons. Firstly, these journals need to monopolize. Obviously, if you are a greater monopoly, if you are able to exclude people from being access to you, if you have less competition, it means you can jack up your costs. It means there's less countervailing demand and supply competitors to you, which means that you get more revenue for your shareholders or not. Secondly, the institutions of education like Harvard work independently and work to strike deals with these journals in order to funnel research bidirectionally. It means that people like researchers, like publishers, like students who go to Harvard have an incentive to only publish in these journals so that they get more prestige, but also that these journals can establish and continue to establish their prestige. Thirdly, because these academics are established, because you are a tenured professor, because you have more citations, because you are already in the Nature or the Excelsior journal, because you have an incentive to prevent other professors from also publishing or getting as much citations or as much prestige, it means you have the capacity to obfuscate, you have the capacity to hide behind this exclusivity. Fourthly, the vast majority of institutions and students in the status quo have no alternatives. We provide that when you give them the option of piracy, because the vast majority of institutions are not extremely wealthy institutions like Harvard, like Western education institutions. They don't have massive 6 or 7 or 8 digit endowments from governments. That is something that exists on our side of the house. Those individuals are massively beneficial. That is expanding the scope of this debate. Fifthly, these journals use tactics of lobbying and things like that to perpetuate policy, to perpetuate legal statutes, to prevent these individuals and the people who build these piracy sites from being able to access and disseminate this information. Sixthly, they just use lawsuits to perniciously push down on these individuals and things like that. I'll take a point from closing if they have one. Opening.
Okay, so you aren't telling me why stealing research, which is piracy, is a moral obligation. You're telling me that monopolies are bad and do horrible things, and we
Yes.
solve that. You don't do jack shit. You're morally fucked.
Okay, so I don't think you solve monopolies at all on your side of the house. But secondly, as I explained to you, to stand against things that exist in evil is something you should support. That is something that is good. Like to stand against an oppressive government, or to stand for your rights, or to stand in disruptive protest is something that you should support. That is something that is morally justified. Second principle, solidarity, two ways. The first thing I'm going to explain is that the average academic is materially poor. And I think the mechanism for this is very simple, because you have, firstly, no access to royalties, because you lack the leverage, you lack the exclusion, you lack access to IP rights. All of those things are monopolized by these journals and by these institutions. You lack bargaining in the counterfactual. We give that option. We give that bargaining, because you can now go to these journals. You can now go to these public sites. You can now go to these pirators. Secondly, you rely on tenuring and teaching and grants to get money. You don't rely on royalties. I think the OIV knows that. Thirdly, you have just no commercial access in the counterfactual, because they say that this research is specialized. It's unlikely you're going to be hired by like a government or by like BP or whatever. When you look at the stories of these individuals, they're stories of people who sink 8 years into something that they deeply love, a PhD in Egyptology. But the problem is no one wants you and your skill set, because that means you have to go to either these institutions of prestige, you have to teach, or you have to publish in these journals. Secondly, in terms of principle solidarity, why do we offer solidarity? Because firstly, it's a support motion, which means comparatively on our side of the house, we get far more popularization and far more usage of these forms of piracy. This is good. Firstly, because you give a freedom and alternative for these people who have no other choice. It means that you have another way to express your education and to access your education and to deliver and move around your information. Secondly, we flip OO's thing about here, which is to say you get collectivization, which means a large body of people, of PhD publishers and things like that, are able to move to these alternatives. Thirdly, you just give these people the capacity to rebel. I think that is a principle good. Thirdly and finally, in terms of self-defense, the violence of exclusion which exists within these journals, which disproportionately use capital to literally oppress these individuals. To stand against these things is to stand against these, the existence of these journals, to stand with self-defense. The reason that you are able to prove and able to condone yourself with these things is the reason that you should support closing. This is the reason you should support the piracy of academic journalism.
Okay, thank the speaker for that speech. And to continue the debate, very proud to call upon member of opposition. Ooh.
Hi, I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. By CG's logic, no one should ever be justified in pursuing self-interest so long as they benefit from privilege whatsoever, even if they never set foot in pursuing this privilege themselves. First off, I think researchers are innocent, so we show you why you harm researchers. I'll show you this in a second. Secondly, CG supports a world where all information is pirated. This removes any incentive for research to occur beyond government interest. This removes all pathways for people to discover research. There are many governments which are with unjustified and perverse incentives. I have no clue why CG's case works. It's a pretty slippery slope if it only works in some Goldilocks zone of piracy and not as its absolute. So CG's out of this round. But also, I'm just going to show you why we're going to benefit underprivileged researchers in smaller institutions significantly more in opposition, so that they're still dependent on a practical argument of benefiting some degree of research occurring. Cool. OG asks a great question then. If the economic vitality of these papers are so threatened, how are they still alive? OO tries to answer this. I'm going to show you what the actual answer is. First off, publishers lose a lot of money, like 30% or some crap, like from piracy, which is why they then raise prices onto the researchers. The thing is, there are a lot of people in the status quo who can pay for research, but choose not to. Passing the prices onto the researchers is how CEO is going to access all of the OO's impacts of why researchers are now, especially the underprivileged ones, are not able to accomplish a lot of research. And also even the best researchers are going to incur additional expenses and can no longer have good quality research. First off, then, why is it the case that people who can pay don't pay for journals? I think there's a few reasons that are quite accessible. First off, it's just convenient to do so. But secondly, people don't like spending money, especially the wealthy people who are already subscribed to significant amounts of journals. They've done the virtue signaling. They're not going to get backlash because they didn't pay for 1 or 2 additional smaller journals that are probably still priced relatively high because they still have to get researchers. Third off, it's become normative to pirate within society. So it's not particularly frowned on that heavily when individuals are doing these types of things. So sure, maybe OG can argue some institutions will still do this, but the majority of the majority of the reading does happen on individuals. So professors are probably okay with pirating in these instances. Second, then, you either charge people to read or you charge people to publish. In the past, you just charge people to read, but because piracy, you charge people more money. And so in order to make up the lost amounts of money that you were getting from the readers who are no longer going to be paying for you, you pass on all of this additional cost to all of the researchers now. So like publishers will now charge you significant amounts of money to publish. They charge you money per page. It costs like thousands to publish for every single page. It doesn't cost much to subscribe, but it costs a lot to publish. And the reason for this is because there's a lot of subscribers, but there's not that many publishers. So you can pass the price on to significant amounts of subscribers, but you won't pass it on to that many researchers, which is why it costs so many researchers so much money to even exist in the publisher in the first place. But on top of this, there is some competition in the status quo, or especially in a world with less piracy. So if people were to pay for journals, they wouldn't do the page fee because they would just be outcompeted by other journals. It's specifically in the instances when piracy is occurring, especially to a greater extent, now you do have this incentive to pass prices onto your researchers. Third, I think you still need to go through publishers to do the publishing. All the teams do agree on this except for CG. So like researchers and readers really value papers having been peer reviewed and being legitimate. And this legitimacy is being granted by institutions like publishers. So it's still necessary to go through these routes. Fourth off, publishers are the only access point for researchers to get to publish. If it's true that publishers want to maintain demand and not alienate their subscribers, especially given subscribers could just choose to pirate, then they raise prices on researchers to make up for the lost subscription prices made from piracy. This is bad for researchers and thus the quality of research. And don't let CG get away with saying we abolish all publishers and therefore all researchers go independent. I feel like Whippets can go rogue with something like this. Don't think that actually works, given in a supports motion, you do have to prove why, like, I don't know, maybe the government will support these types of things. Publishers probably have lobbying power to prevent this from happening. I'll take OG like at 5 or something. So let's do some impacting then, because I think that OO does a little bit of the stuff on like underprivileged researchers. I feel like the much more important impact is just on economies of scale of even the better researchers in divesting more money into doing their research, right? So first off, you need a lot of equipment, a lot of lab stuff. Anders POIs this and doesn't really get a response. It's the fact that you have, like, when you're developing very particular drugs, you have to do molecular engineering or whatever. You need cutting edge techniques that are literally pushing the boundaries of what is considered possible on Earth right now in every single field in order to actually get this development. Otherwise, you never access the best quality development. And any particular breakthrough can literally change the entire world and save millions of lives. Think like, I don't know, maybe finding a cure to an additional strand of cancer, or maybe like preventing the Greenland ice sheets from collapsing and therefore saving a bunch of cities from sinking. I think that these impacts cannot be outweighed in this round. But secondly, there's also just a lot of other streams that are severely underfunded and thus even preventing people from being able to access doing research in these areas in the first place. Arts and humanities are often thoroughly underfunded, which is to say people don't get to buy equipment, people don't get to do like launch actual surveys. Like even if you do get surveys, it's the type of stuff they get rewarded like 10 cents to do online. I'll take OG.
Yes, so we preempted this. Large companies, governments, and institutions will pay for journals if they produce unique research independent of their size. Think about all the random niche journals your university subscribes to. And there's ginormous public support for research to keep journals publishing without disincentivizing researchers by making them pay. It is never explained, furthermore, why these will be counterfactually successful or impactful. Far more exclusively, we give—
Okay, yeah, that's 15 seconds. So the issue with this, though, I don't think it's necessarily true that the governments have infinite incentive to continue wanting to fund you. There is, at some point, there is going to be a capacity issue. And if it's the instances where the government is now taking on the entire burden of funding, which, mind you, is not like that much of the burden, right? If they're taking a significantly greater margin of the funding, it's probably also true then in OG's world that they're going to start funding only the researchers who have produced a lot of results, which primarily are going to be the researchers who already historically had privilege. So you eat yourself with this argument. Let's quickly weigh against OO then. OO says monopoly is because of rampant piracy that makes it impossible to start smaller publishing routes. routes. The issue with this is that it only proves capacity. It never proves incentive. It's true that smaller publishers on OO now have capacity to publish because they get more money, but I'm not sure why people have an incentive to read smaller journal brands, because they probably find it difficult to compete with prestigious journals. The smaller journals will still be largely unprofitable unless OO can show why they earn significant enough attention and thus likely still don't exist. So we're able to prove to you this on CO. But secondly, just weighing our additional impacting that you can access only through our mechanism against OO anyway. The magnitude of change we likely get on shifting on like major issues like cancer research and preservation of like old growth trees can save millions of lives. But on top of this, if research is to go awry, which is to say, if somebody does something incorrectly, they produce a drug with a nasty side effect, or maybe they figured out some like safety hazard with their nuclear plant, this is significantly greater of an impact. We show you why funding for research is it's just going to be paramount above all things, because when you don't have a secure, safe place to do nuclear reactions, when you don't feed people safe drugs, this is when you kill millions of people. I don't think this was the goal the government had. I don't think this is what OG wants either. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and to sum up the entire debate, Gov side, very proud to call government week.
All right, just give it a second. What we support at Closing Government is piracy at the point that structures exist to actively and explicitly obstruct and deny people access to things they ought have access to. Where groups commit acts of violent exclusion, they ought be opposed. Good people on Closing Government break bad laws because they understand it is their moral duty to oppose these systems of oppression, to oppose these systems of exclusion, and to break them down. The opposition response is to say, well, actually, it is piracy that further consolidates these groups and leads to them being systems of oppression, leads to monopolies. Why then is that not true? This directly responds to OO. That is because it is actually, regardless of whether piracy exists or not, journals will tend towards consolidation. That is because large institutional buyers who have large but not like infinite budgets will just pay only for the most prestigious journals. They will be able to demand the most prestigious, most cutting edge papers. And that means the funds and the capital and the power and the prestige will always condense onto specific journals who will then be able to buy up other journals to protect themselves, to engage in things like economies of scale. Those sorts of things meant that they were likely to consolidate. But secondly, it was because journals had a monopoly on individual papers. That meant that if you were if you were the more prestigious journal, you were more likely to be able to demand and accept the most prestigious, most important, most in demand papers. And that meant that more people would come to you. The thing here that opening opposition seems to miss is that scientific papers aren't like up and coming indie bands where you're trying to find the most edgy, newest thing. They are the thing where you do just want the big pop star. You want the big names who are doing the cutting edge stuff that you know is famous, that you know is important. There is no interest in experimentally investing in accessing a new journal. You invest in journals and buy access to them because you know they produce things that are very, very useful to your university. Thirdly, because of the monopoly these journals have, they're able to engage in prestige. That means they're able to demand much, much higher prices for their journals, and that means they're able to buy up more of university budgets, and that means they're also able to make more money and then buy up other journals. But also they're just able to demand the most exclusive papers. They can also take advantage of economies of scale. The issue with the opening opposition case was that maybe you believe that they did prove that maybe journals did diversify, but they never identified a group of people who changed their habits in such a way, to such a degree, that necessarily did create new journals. They were oh, but people won't pay for now that people aren't pirating anymore, they're going to pay for journals. That's not the case. The simple fact is the people that pirate, and the large portion of people that pirate, are people that have no capacity or incentive to pay for these papers. If they don't pirate them, they would just stop reading them because it's really expensive, right? To pay for these papers, you have to buy papers across many, many different journals because your research isn't nicely put into a single journal. The best research is spread across many, many different journals. So you have to go and seek those out. Those things meant that the people that were engaging in these weren't people that were connected with institutions. It's important to note here that institutions buy very, very large portions of journals. So the amount of piracy that occurred within major institutions was very, very small. And that meant that opening opposition was unable to prove any of their benefits because they never proved the crux of their argument, which was the capacity for enough people to buy papers to like establish and support new journals. That is where closing opposition tries to get up on them. And they say that because there's there like, and they try and say that like there's specific people that can buy these things. The issue here is that firstly, a huge bunch of their mechs are massively mitigated by explaining that actually people access these journals through institutions, which means they have access to huge amounts of them. So it wasn't like professors or people that like had the capacity to pay for these things that were going to stop pirating. Those people didn't pirate in the first place. But secondly, they say that piracy meant that you could like had to change the way that you published. The issue was that the publishing habits of journals was not a product of piracy; it was a product of the monopoly. It was the fact that they were able to demand. Their claim is like they have to balance out piracy with the way they treat academics, and so more piracy means they treat academics less well. That's not true. The reason they treat academics less well is because academics want to publish in these journals. Academics are like doing anything and everything they can to be published in Nature or Science or any of the big journals. And so it didn't matter whether there was lots of piracy or a little piracy, because Science only published 20 to 50 papers a year. That meant that academics would do just about anything to get in there, including paying to be published in there, including ceding all of their rights. And that meant that it was really like that academics made no money off these journals. So you had no moral obligation to them to do those things, right? It was the product of the journal's monopoly on ideas and the journal's monopoly on prestige that meant that they could exploit academics. It was not their simple monopoly on the market. Those monopolies on prestige never changed under their side of the house because that prestige was built on blood, and that is what Isaac told you. Because we made it very clear at closing government that you have a moral obligation to engage in piracy here, because these journals exist in such a way that they actively exploit all of those who are involved. Before I whip this extension, I will take opening.
Your whole case is that expensive journals are still inaccessible because of piracy, because of prosecution and rich universities still getting that money. We tell you incentives as to why small universities get money on our side. So in your best case, you give money to Oxford and don't give money to small universities while we give you money to them. We should win on just that alone.
Yeah, so your push about small universities falls for twofold. One, we explain very clearly that because of the monopoly on prestige that journals have, they do not ever pay money to people for their articles. They do not ever get royalties. When you pirate a textbook, you're not taking away from your lecturer because your lecturer got a single lump sum payment. That is why academics regularly make their articles very easy to pirate. But then in terms of small institutions being able to support their local community and do specific targeted research, there were so many other ways that they could engage in this without publishing in journals. They could just attend forums, have public, make this research available in many, many other ways that were more likely to get funding. So that fell out of the debate on that level. It didn't matter that these things became more expensive. It didn't matter what occurred as a result of you pirating, because you had a fundamental pre-existing moral obligation to oppose the harm that was being done, to take steps to circumvent it, to stand in solidarity with those who were being oppressed, to stand in solidarity with those groups that couldn't access these journals in the first place, to stand in solidarity with the academics whose lives were being taken for granted, whose lives were being ruined by these journals, not paying them for their ideas, not treating them well. It did not matter what the outcome of that was. It was the fact that you had an obligation to do it in the first place that we explained to you very clearly and specifically. We explained to you this extends both with a moral obligation to stand against abhorrent practices within society, regardless of the outcome. Secondly, it was an obligation of solidarity. And thirdly, it was an obligation of self-defense, because these journals presented a direct attack on people's livelihood, because inability to access this knowledge in places did mean people were hurt or died. But some people, it meant their lives couldn't progress in the way they wanted it to. Those were direct and immediate threats that did exist, but you ought to have an ability to respond. This got over our opening because it was a far higher burden, and it existed regardless of the outcome. Because at the point where you accepted what these journals did was abhorrent, which all parties in this debate did, you had an obligation to oppose that, to take a stand, to undermine those companies. That is what we gave you at closing. That is why we take this debate.
Okay, we've heard that speech, and to continue and now sum up the entire debate for a political opposition.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, all right, 1 second. Okay, so a few things. First of all, I'm going to whip the extension that my partner just gave you, explain why it's round winning. Then I'll do direct comparisons to all of the other teams in the round. Okay, so first of all, I think that there's some clarification that needs to be done here, right? All of these teams just assert that there's like a total monopoly. And I think that this is unrealistic. As my partner tells you, there is some degree of competition within the space. In each publishing field, there are still a few journals that are highly prestigious. So look, in philosophy, you have like ethics, you have American Philosophy Association, you have news. In science, you have science and nature. So this means that authors oftentimes have 2 or 3 choices. This means that publishers are not able to just do literally whatever they want because there's still some internal competition. Furthermore, to the extent that Gov tells you that like authors need journals, it's equally true that journals need authors, or else there's literally nothing to publish. So I think the mutual dependence means that there's more symmetry than they say. Finally, this type of ahistorical assertion that, look, they've just always been like publishing page fees is just not true. These are new artifacts in the last 10 years because the advent of the widespreadness of the internet made it actually possible for people to pirate way more. Ergo, journals lost a lot of money and then they passed this on to academics in the form of page fees. You literally need to publish to advance. And so this means that I think that that there's no way of opting out of these page fees. This just costs researchers a lot and it makes it a lot harder for them to advance. Also, on like the government budget issue, look, I think that governments often have a limited research budget that they set aside beforehand. So to the extent that they're higher page fees, this means directly less money goes towards innovation. If you believe the opposite, though, if you think that actually there is like some degree to which governments are able to do their budgets fungibly, which is unrealistic because usually these are like set on high and those types of priorities don't have enough, like Congress doesn't have enough priority to debate, enough time to like debate how much you're going to allocate extra for charging fees. But even if that's the case, then we obviously beat OG because OG tells us that like the extra cost is not going to be absorbed by researchers. Okay. And then lastly, like just to clarify, like there are a bunch of people who could buy journals and don't. First of all, I think that what a lot of the Gov teams miss, as my partner tells you, is that you buy in package deals. And these package deals for like Oxford, Cambridge, etc., usually have like hundreds of journals, but they don't have every journal, right? And the issue is academics are oftentimes hunting down individual journals because there's some subject that they're particularly interested in. So I think the counterfactual is that when an academic finds a journal that's not within their pre-existing subscription, they pay an extra like one-time fee, like a $30, $40 to access one paper so that they could get that. I think that that is fairly standard. And also there are like other groups like private small startups and community colleges, private companies, etc., which don't have such large reputational effects, but still have enough money to pay. It's just they don't pay if they think that they could get away with it, right? I think the counterfactual is that they are able to pay and they actually pay. Okay. Then I think that the net effect is that because there's all of these extra page fees, because the journals have to recoup money somehow, and so they recoup money the only other way that they have contact with other people, with universities, namely by charging to publish. This means that first of all, you get less research quality because there's less money available for like further testing, safety testing, etc. This is really bad at like when you're talking about stuff like medical advances, but it's also bad when you get like less research in a billion other fields like philosophy or whatever you like. But also it means that particularly the minoritized communities that OG says they care so much about are actively worse off at the point where it's harder for them to publish. And oftentimes the issue is that what they're going to publish is uniquely very, very helpful to their local communities. So to the extent you're preventing them from publishing, this is very bad. Okay, now let me explain why we explicitly beat OG. But before that, I'll take the OG POI.
Yep. You're right. Journals don't charge scientists higher fees because journals want to attract the best scientists to publish with them in order to justify high prices to institutions paying. We're happy to bite the bullet that McKinsey or Oxford pays more money for research if it means the poorest researchers, students, and startups are able to access research, which is a precondition for innovation and development.
Yeah, so the issue is that I think that, first of all, even if we buy this OG assertion that it's a precondition, there's another precondition for development, which is being able to explicitly publish that research, right? It's useless for you to research a bunch if you can't publish the research. And we tell you that companies are going to do this because the fact of the matter is that there isn't, like, these companies are not running on massive profits. They just have to pay the bills. And so if they're not going to be able to pay it by subscriptions, they will have no other choice but to put it on research lists for publishing, right? It's not like they have a choice about this because they fundamentally don't have enough money to pay their writing staff if they don't charge money. Okay, so quickly why we beat OG. First of all, as I already explained, there are 2 prerequisites, right? So if you buy the OG case, they tell you that reading articles is a prerequisite, but we also tell you that publishing is a prerequisite for things like academic advancement. It's also a prerequisite for being able to have like other people access your work and build upon it, and for it to be like socially useful because like private companies will read your work and then develop on it and like develop like a cancer cure or whatever, right? So first of all, we think that we're willing to bite the trade-off that you have to pay extra money to access in order to pay less to publish. Two reasons. First of all, we tell you that the cost is just higher of paying, right? So as Raymond told you, there are a lot more people who access journals than people who publish in journals. So this means that you're able to spread the cost out among a wider base if it's the case that people are paying to read instead of paying to publish, right? So the individual cost is lower. That means it hurts researchers less. Second of all, on optionality, right? We tell you that it is possible to do some degree of research, especially in things like arts and philosophy, without having to read a huge amount of academic literature, right? So for example, a lot of stuff is often available in textbooks. We tell you that oftentimes when it comes to like social work and stuff, like if you look at like Fanon, right, he doesn't require that you have like a bunch of background in other researchers. So I think that it's possible for people like that to make academic advancement in a world where they have to pay to read, but it's not possible for that to be disseminated at all if you have to pay to publish. Okay, then why do we beat CG? Look, I think CG's major principle is a principle of historical injustice. Two responses to this. First of all, I think that like their principle is pretty ridiculous because it implies that like all IP is wrong. You should just violate IP all of the time because all of that IP is based on historically unjust things. I think that that's wrong. But second of all, like just look at the weighing, right? The weighing is that I think that it is worthwhile to in some ways be principally unjust if it means that the overall quality of life of the people concerned is better, right? So the weighing is super obvious here, right? Intuition pump, is it okay to tax people in countries that have historically been colonized if that tax money is like going to go to schools? Obviously, right? Because even though you're taking money away from people who like have a principal right to that money because they've been deprived of it in the past, it's actually going to be used in ways that are more beneficial to them in the long term. Similarly, we tell you that it's like the same sort of idea. Even if you're forcing people to pay for costs, it's going to be more beneficial to the extent that you're able to get more access to research. So we obviously outweigh that. Okay, then OO quickly. I think there are three main. So OO's major push in this debate is that like they get more competition because you get a lot more journals, and then there's journals like having internal competition. A few issues. First of all, I'm not clear that the margin of profit on journals is high enough that if there's more competition, that they're able to actually decrease the price of publishing that much, right? Second of all, I tell you that it's not clear that you're going to get that much competition, as my partner told you, because I think that like marginally this might happen, but you have something like prestige, which is historically generated. But third of all, we tell you that even if they're right, even if you decrease the cost of reading articles, I think that the thing that's more important is the cost to publish because that's way higher because there are way fewer people. So even if you buy their entire case, we obviously outweigh that. Ergo, I think CEO wins. Thank you.
Okay, we thank the speaker for that speech, and I thank everyone for this debate. Lovely debate. Thank you.